So I'll try to be short. Actually, I will not go into, say, the so-called the laws of value and all that. We've discussed some of that in the previous weeks. But what I want to focus on section 4, the fetishism of commodities and the secret thereof, is basically what Marx does right from the beginning of that section, and a few passages down, he goes back to first he emphasizes why this is important, the mystery of commodities. Then he very directly he talks about theology in the sense of, like, let's approach this in a way that we will be able to demystify commodities, what is involved in commodification. And that is the link I want to actually focus on. And that's why this is also kind of a return to the earlier discussions we've had in this course. So going back all the way to Feuerbach, the critique, Marx's critique of Feuerbach's take on religion. But what he's doing here now, he's basically treating commodity as another human-made mystery, but mystery because we fall into that kind of the deception, that kind of hole again. So, and the analogy there is very important, because remember, on that level, Marx agrees with Feuerbach that, of course, we created God, and then we kind of fell victim to that mystery ourselves. So that's the analogy. That's what happens with the commodities. But the difference, remember, the argument that Marx had against Feuerbach is that there are social conditions for that. There are social and historical conditions for why that happens, that mystification, right? And it is the same here, of course, but by now he doesn't even go into explaining that argument. It should be clear to a reader of Marx that every mystification is, of course, every mystery is, of course, in that sense, has social and historical circumstances of its production. And again, production is the central concept, because not only in terms of the production of commodities, but also production of, let's say, certain modes of perception, right? So what is involved here then? Marx tries to kind of unmask that, demystify that, what is involved in commodification. And that's why also he focus on the term fetishism, fetish, and that is so important in any serious study of history of religions and religiosity and so on. As you know, it comes in Freud's lectures and writings. He talks about the fetish and so on. So these are the focal points: commodity, mystification, demystification, and fetishism. So what happens? First, of course, to Marx, it's very important to remember that, again, just going back for another point, one of his main differences with what Marx and Engels called vulgar socialism is that Marx doesn't focus only on distribution, so to speak. They did. they focused mostly on distribution of wealth. To Marx, that's vulgar because something else very central is involved, and that is, of course, production. Like the main thing that is ignored in bourgeois political economy is what is involved in production. And this is still one of the big misunderstandings about Marx and about socialism in general, that right away people assume that once you talk about, or once they hear about socialism, they assume they assume it is the whole point is distribution, right? Distribution of wealth, or equal distribution, right? Or fair distribution. All these things, Marx dealt with them early in his writings, right? And related to that, it's very crucial to remember that Marx actually didn't write like an ethical philosophy, like or philosophy of morality in that sense. So to him, even some people did some in-depth research into these conflicts, these ideas. In Marx's writings, but also in terms of different interpretations of Marx's writings. So one of those people, for example, Daniel Ben Said, a very interesting character Marxist from 20th century, wrote a book called Marx for Our Times. There, he dedicated a good chunk of the book to this question of justice and how it should be understood in Marx's work. So to Marx, justice, the idea of justice, the concept of justice is also historically determined, right? So he didn't have this that would be other forms of socialism or forms of morality, that this idea of equal distribution. Why? Because justice requires, or fairness requires that. Now Marx would argue that under capitalism there's a certain conception of justice. When the modes of production, let's say, change, that conception will change as well. So you see, he always avoided that kind of metaphysical mistake, because you take courses, say, or you read books about ethics, morality, whatnot. There is always this problem that the assumption that these concepts are kind of ideal. They live like kind of with the Platonic forms, if you will. That's not the case for Marx, of course. Because at the end, our ideas of justice are also historical, like everything else, like all our practices, and at the end, to put it very, very briefly, it is a production. It's part of the production, right? Okay, so now let's take all this back to commodification and demystifying commodification. So to put it very briefly, through those relations of production under capitalism, humans enter certain social relations that are material, that, in other words, that are not even social in a sense anymore. And the relations between commodities become social, become human, right? So Marx emphasized that also here. Again, the relations between commodities become humanized, become subjectivized, become social. But relations between human to human become all materialized. And why is that? That is also part of the mystifying effects of commodity forms, of commodity relations, why our relations become materialistic in that sense. Yeah. So one of the things, again, the Marx is misunderstood about is this materialism or materialist versus materialistic. Marx, if I were to try to kind of describe his position on these issues in general, like general philosophical terms, he is for a beautiful life philosophically. His philosophy, in a way, is a protest against that kind of materialistic forms of social relations. So, in fact, the debate with the so-called spiritualists a lot of times just misleading. Marx describing the world under capitalism when he tells us that social relations become material in that sense. And he obviously he protests against that. That doesn't have to be the case. And he's not, again, he's not speaking in terms of what ought to be. So that's another very important distinction, because you always hear about, things like why, things like liberation theology and whatnot. What is the problem with that, right? And of course, Marx always had a serious problem with that kind of, sentimental, let's say, sentimentalist socialism or egalitarianism and so on. Okay, so let's move on then. Back to commodity and demystifying commodities. So you read the text. It's in a way straightforward. If you go back earlier in the text, he talks, of course, more about, he establishes all the theory of values, so exchange value versus use value, and when exchange value becomes dominant and what it means. So that, and there's a ton of literature about that in the Marxist or Marxian schools. But if I were to summarize that to kind of help us dive deeper into it and grasp the philosophical problem there, I would say simply the following. Through the domination of exchange value, what happens is quantification of everything. Right? Because if Marx makes the point that not all products of labor are commodities necessarily. What makes them commodities is basically one thing, one idea, one issue. And that is the exchange value. When you live in a society or under modes of production that put all the primary kind of significance on exchange value, then by definition, remember he has all that discussion, how these commodities, products can be exchangeable, can be valued. They must have something in common. And that something in common is not a quality of uniqueness. By definition, it can't be. It's something that ties them together. They overlap there, and that is exchange value. And by virtue of having that exchange value, but not only that, but also having that element determining their value, this is very important. That determines their value. Then some Marxists reach a point where they just say value. They don't even see the need to any longer say exchange value as opposed to use value. So that value then is the determining value of everything. And then by definition, everything is quantified, right? But everything is quantified. This is part of the story of the commodity. So we look at commodities, then we make this wrong assumptions. We assume that value has something to do with the actual social labor that went into it and so on. Remember, he says he literally makes the point that we do it and we don't know it. We do it without knowing it, right? So that is the ideological kind of trick right there. We do it without knowing it. So the commodity then becomes a quantifying force, a quantifying locus, right? It ends up quantifying us also, like not just our relations, but literally it quantifies us in the sense of it, it determines our significance down the road in terms of power, politics, and so on and so forth, and social values and so on. And he gives you all that list of examples, how the person with capital would gain all these powers, artistic, literary, whatever, you name it, political, and so on and so forth. But what is happening actually, exactly because of that, we are dehumanized. We just fell into kind of the trick, the trap we perhaps unconsciously, at least on the individual level, unconsciously set up under capitalism. So there is one more point I want to make. I'm a little hesitant, though, to take that step. And that has to do with an argument regarding the relationship again between theology and capitalism in that sense, in the sense of the power of capital, so to speak. The overwhelming power of capital, or let's say the single locus of power in capital. And okay, that point is, let me just check the time, how long. Okay, that point, I would argue that that kind of hegemony of capitalism and capital reached a point where actually we don't need, so this is my argument, I've just finished this thing for a work that will be published soon. The argument is that we don't even need to go to theology in order to understand, like the critique of theology, in order to understand commodity relations and the mystifying power of commodities. In fact, it is the other way around. What do I mean? In order for theology to work, in order for God to be God, it seems that God has to borrow the language of commodities, of capital. Yeah? And, following Marx's example, I will be empirical and give you an example. So this is not just speculation. And here's my example. So there is this book called Checkbook of the Bank of Faith. It's actually written late 19th century. And it is still in print. And that is exactly what I mean. So basically, the book is designed to function as a checkbook. And the idea is that everything you do for God, it will be saved in your kind of bank account. And, more recent publishers came up with all kinds of ideas to print the book as actual checkbooks. Every page is kind of a check with, with the quotes and all that. That is, so I will show you, I will share my screen with you now to actually show you what is written, what the publishers say themselves about the book. But you see what's happening here. In order for God to have, you know, for people to have faith in God and for God to work and so on, God needs to submit to the language of capitalism, in other words, to speak in the language of money and bank and check and saving and investment and whatnot. And that is very interesting to me. I found that to be to be profound in terms of the understanding, at least the scope of the hegemony we are talking about today. So I'll just share my screen with you. Just give me a second, please, because that's the whole point then. I don't need to say anymore. I just need to show you this. You will read the description, and that will be basically the concluding part of the lecture here. So this is just one example of those one of those editions. God's words is filled with promises made to his people. And each promise is like a bank check. We receive it now knowing that it points to a future fulfillment. This simple idea led a 19th century preacher Charles Spurgeon and so on and so forth. So that is and you have 365 checks, a check for every day. But you get the point. What I'm trying to say is that if before commodity, like capital needed to speak the language of theology, or let's say borrow tricks of theology, now theology needs to borrow the tricks of capital in order to be mystifying enough. And that's the whole point of ideology, isn't it? Right? To have that mystifying power, to put it very directly and simply, to make people act against their own interests. For example,